They say coming home should feel like a warm embrace. But what happens when home becomes the battlefield you never saw coming? When the girl who conquered alien worlds finds that the real monsters were waiting in the hallways of her old high school. This isn't just another story about a soldier returning from war. This is about discovering that some battles can only be fought by those who've learned that humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons or our technology, but our refusal to give up on each other, even when darkness threatens to consume everything we hold dear. Sometimes the most important war isn't fought among the stars, but in the place where it all began. The transport shuttle's engines hummed their familiar song as Sarah Chen pressed her face against the small porthole, watching Earth grow larger with each passing moment. 3 years. 3 years since she'd left this blue marble behind to join the Terran Defense Corps, and now she was coming home. But the girl who had left at 18 was not the same person returning at 21. Her reflection stared back from the reinforced glass. Lean face marked by thin scars, dark eyes that had seen too much, hands that could disassemble a plasma rifle in under 30 seconds. The other passengers on the civilian transport gave her nervous glances, noting the military bearing she couldn't quite shake, the way she automatically cataloged exits and potential threats. They didn't know about the Kepler campaign, or the 3 months she'd spent behind enemy lines on Arcturus Prime, or how she'd held the line at Firebase 7 when the hegemony threw everything they had at the human defenders. "First time back?" asked the elderly man sitting across from her. His kind eyes reminded her of her grandfather. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the crisp tone that had become second nature during her service. "Been away for a while." "Military?" He gestured toward the small Terran Defense Corps pin on her jacket collar. Sarah nodded. "Just finished my tour," the man's expression softened with respect. "Thank you for your service, young lady. My grandson's about your age. He keeps talking about enlisting, but—" He trailed off, perhaps seeing something in Sarah's eyes that made him reconsider what he'd been about to say. "It's an honor to serve," Sarah said automatically, the words she'd been trained to say. But underneath, she wondered if this man's grandson really understood what he'd be signing up for. Did he know about the screams of wounded Marines echoing through the corridors of a damaged starship? Did he understand what it felt like to aim a rifle at another sentient being and pull the trigger because it was them or your squad? The shuttle shuddered slightly as it entered Earth's atmosphere, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with something that wasn't motion sickness. Home. She was going home to Millbrook, the small town where nothing ever happened, where the biggest crisis was usually the annual debate about whether to replace the old water tower. She wondered if it would feel as small as she remembered, or if 3 years of fighting across multiple star systems had changed her perspective on everything. The spaceport in New Geneva was massive, a gleaming complex that served as the primary hub for civilian space travel. Sarah shouldered her duffel bag and made her way through the crowds, automatically noting security cameras, guard positions, and crowd flow patterns. Old habits. The customs line moved quickly for returning citizens, and soon she was standing in the arrival area scanning for her family. "Sarah!" She turned to see her younger brother Marcus pushing through the crowd, taller than she remembered and wearing the blue blazer of Millbrook High School. Behind him came her parents, her mother already crying, her father trying to maintain composure but failing as his eyes misted over ties and questions. Her mother held her so tightly that Sarah could smell her familiar perfume, could feel the trembling in her shoulders. Her father's embrace was briefer but no less emotional, and she could see him studying the changes in her face, the way she held herself, the unconscious way she positioned herself with clear sight lines to all approaches. "You look so grown up," her mother whispered. "So different. 3 years will do that," Sarah said gently. It wasn't just the 3 years, though. It was the battles, the decisions she'd had to make, the friends she'd lost. It was learning that humans weren't alone in the galaxy, and that not all of their neighbors were friendly. Marcus chattered excitedly during the ride back to Millbrook, filling her in on town gossip, his classes, his plans for college. Sarah listened with half her attention, the other half automatically tracking their route, noting changes in the landscape, the security measures at various checkpoints. Earth felt safer than the frontier worlds, but after Arcturus Prime, she'd learned that safety was always temporary. Millbrook looked exactly the same, down to the faded paint on Miller's hardware store and the perpetually blinking traffic light at Main and 3rd. Their house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and her mother's rose garden. Sarah's room was exactly as she'd left it. Band posters on the walls, her old telescope by the window, textbooks from her senior year still stacked on the desk. "We didn't want to change anything," her mother explained, "in case you wanted everything the same when you came back." Sarah nodded, though the room felt like it belonged to a stranger. The girl who had lived here had worried about calculus tests and prom dates, not whether the perimeter sensors would detect hegemony infiltrators before they could sabotage the fusion reactor. That night, the family gathered for dinner. Her mother had made her famous pot roast, and they sat around the same table where Sarah had done homework and played board games. The conversation was careful, skirting around the details of her service. They asked general questions. Had she made friends? Had she seen interesting places? Was she glad to be back? Sarah answered honestly but vaguely. How could she explain the bonds forged in combat, friendships that meant you die for someone without hesitation? How could she describe the alien worlds she'd walked on, some beautiful beyond imagination, others scarred by war? "So what's next?" her father asked as her mother served dessert. "Are you planning to go to college? Use your military benefits?" "I'm thinking about it," Sarah replied. "Actually, there's something else first. The Corps has a program where veterans can go back to their old high schools, help with recruiting and career guidance. I've been assigned to Millbrook High for the spring semester." Her parents exchanged glances. "That's wonderful," her mother said. "You always were good with younger kids." Marcus grinned. "That's awesome. You'll be at my school. Everyone's going to flip when they see a real Space Marine." Sarah smiled, though something cold settled in her stomach. "I'm looking forward to it." Later that night, she stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street. The stars were barely visible through Earth's atmosphere and light pollution, so different from the brilliant displays she'd grown used to on frontier worlds. Everything here was soft, muted, safe. No plasma fire lighting up the night sky, no air raid sirens, no need to sleep with a rifle within arm's reach. So why did she feel more unsettled now than she had in a firefight? Her secure communicator chimed softly, a message from Captain Rodriguez, her former commanding officer. "How's civilian life treating you, Chen?" Sarah typed back quickly. "Still adjusting, sir." "Starting the school assignment on Monday." "Good. Remember what we discussed. Keep your eyes open. Report anything unusual. Intel suggests hegemony activity in your sector has been increasing." Sarah's blood went cold. The hegemony, humanity's primary alien enemy, was known for their psychological warfare tactics. They didn't just attack military targets. They corrupted and subverted, turning populations against themselves from within. "Understood, sir. Any specific threats?" "Nothing confirmed, but there have been reports from other rural communities. Unusual behavior patterns, social unrest that doesn't match normal demographic trends. Could be nothing. Could be preparation for something bigger." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "I'll keep watch. I know you will. You're one of the best we've got, Chen. There's a reason we chose you for this assignment." As the conversation ended, Sarah looked back out at the peaceful street, at the house where the Hendersons had lived for 20 years, at the park where she'd played as a child, with Trust Teddy. Suddenly, the familiar seemed alien. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every normal suburban scene could mask something sinister. She thought she was coming home to rest, to reconnect with civilian life before deciding on her future. Instead, she might be walking into another kind of war entirely. And this time, the battleground wouldn't be some distant planet. It would be the hallways of her old high school, the place where she'd learned to dream about the stars. Sarah Chen had fought aliens across the galaxy to protect humanity. Now she had to prepare for the possibility that humanity's greatest threat might be growing in her own backyard, disguised as something as innocent as teenage rebellion. The warrior who had left Millbrook as a girl was coming home as a soldier, and she was beginning to suspect she was going to need every skill she'd learned in the crucible of interstellar war. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough, and yet part of her hoped it never would, because once she walked through those familiar doors, there would be no more pretending that home was just home. The war had followed her back to Earth, and this time she might be the only one who could see it coming. Monday morning arrived with the crisp bite of early spring, and Sarah Chen stood before Millbrook High School for the first time in 3 years. The building looked smaller than she remembered, its red brick facade and white columns more quaint than impressive after seeing the massive military academies and alien structures she'd grown accustomed to. Students streamed past her, laughing and shouting to friends, completely unaware that a veteran of interstellar warfare was watching them with growing concern. Something was wrong. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it immediately, but her combat-trained instincts were screaming warnings. The students moved normally, talked normally, but there was an undercurrent she couldn't identify. Too many conversations stopped abruptly when teachers passed, too many furtive glances between certain groups, and the teachers themselves seemed strangely tense, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. "You must be our new career counselor," said a warm voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, hand extended in greeting. "I'm Principal Morrison. We're so excited to have you here." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the woman's firm grip and direct gaze. "Thank you, Principal Morrison. I'm looking forward to working with your students. Please, call me Helen. Why don't I show you around? Your office is ready, and we've scheduled some meetings with students who've expressed interest in military careers." As they walked through the hallways, Sarah's unease grew stronger. The building was clean, well-maintained, with colorful bulletin boards and student artwork decorating the walls. Everything appeared normal, but there were subtle signs that set off her trained instincts. Scratches around certain lock mechanisms that suggested tampering, scuff marks on walls that indicated unusual foot traffic patterns, and an odd smell in certain areas that reminded her of the chemical suppressants used in alien detention facilities. "Here's your office," Helen said, opening a door marked Career Services. The room was small but comfortable, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the student parking lot. "I hope it suits your needs. The previous counselor retired last semester, so you're really filling a gap for us." "What was the previous counselor like?" Sarah asked, settling behind the desk. "Mr. Peterson? Oh, he was with us for 15 years. Said the students were different than they used to be. You know how older teachers can get, thinking every generation is worse than the last?" Sarah nodded, though Peterson's observations aligned with her own growing suspicions. "What did he mean by different?" Helen waved dismissively. "Oh, just the usual complaints. Students being more secretive, less respectful. Honestly, I think social media just makes everything seem more dramatic than it actually is. But enough about that. Let me introduce you to some of our faculty." The introductions were routine on the surface, but Sarah noticed patterns that troubled her. The mathematics teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, kept glancing over her shoulder as they talked. The history teacher, Mr. Jameson, seemed nervous and avoided making direct eye contact. Most concerning was the computer science teacher, Dr. Vance, who showed no surprise at meeting a Terran Defense Corps veteran and asked strangely specific questions about her service record. "Interesting background," Dr. Vance said, his pale blue eyes studying her intently. "Kepler campaign, wasn't it?"
"Heard that was quite brutal." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward where her sidearm would normally rest.
The Kepler campaign wasn't widely reported in civilian media. Only someone with access to classified military databases would know she'd served there. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Do we know each other?" Dr. Vance smiled, but it didn't warm his expression. Not personally, no. I just take an interest in military history. Amazing what you can learn if you know where to look. Before Sarah could respond, the first bell rang and Dr. Vance excused himself with another unsettling smile. Sarah watched him walk away, noting how he moved, too fluid, too precise, like someone trained in combat disciplines. Her first appointment was with a senior named Jake Martinez, a stocky young man with intelligent eyes who'd expressed interest in joining the Terran Defense Corps. He knocked precisely on time and entered with the bearing of someone who understood military protocol. "Ma'am," he said, offering a crisp salute. Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, at ease. "Have a seat, Jake. Tell me about your interest in military service." Jake sat straight-backed, hands folded in his lap. "Ever since the hegemony attack started, I've wanted to do my part to protect humanity. Earth might be safe now, but we need people willing to fight on the frontier worlds." "That's admirable," Sarah said. "But military service isn't just about fighting. There's engineering, logistics, communications, medical corps. What specifically interests you?" "Combat operations," Jake replied immediately. "I want to be where the action is, where I can make a real difference." Something in his tone bothered her. "Jake, have you talked to your parents about this? Military service is a big decision." For the first time, Jake's composed demeanor cracked slightly. "My parents, they don't really understand. They think I should focus on college, get a safe job. They don't see the bigger picture, which is..." Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The hegemony isn't going to stop with the outer colonies. They're patient, but they're coming for Earth eventually. When that happens, we need to be ready. We need people who understand what's at stake." Sarah studied the young man's face, noting the fervent conviction in his voice. It reminded her of the recruitment speeches she'd heard from hegemony defectors, passionate, logical, but with an underlying current of something that felt manufactured. "Jake, where are you getting your information about hegemony strategy? That's pretty detailed knowledge for a high school student." "I read a lot," he said quickly. "Research on my own time. The school's computer lab has access to lots of databases." "What kind of databases?" Jake hesitated, then seemed to catch himself. "Just news sources, analysis sites. You know, trying to stay informed." After Jake left, Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The boy's knowledge of military terminology and hegemony tactics was far too sophisticated for a civilian teenager. Either he was exceptionally well-read and self-motivated, or someone had been providing him with information that should have been classified. Her next 3 appointments were similar. Students expressing sudden, intense interest in military careers, all with surprisingly detailed knowledge of current conflicts and tactical situations. By lunchtime, Sarah's suspicions had crystallized into near certainty that something was systematically influencing these kids. The cafeteria was a chaos of teenage voices and clattering trays, but Sarah found herself studying the social dynamics rather than enjoying her sandwich. Groups clustered at their traditional tables: jocks, theater kids, academic achievers, loners. But there was another pattern underneath, harder to spot but definitely present. Certain students seemed to drift between groups, always listening, occasionally whispering something that would make others lean in closer. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah looked up to see a young teacher sliding into the seat across from her, a woman about her own age with short brown hair and tired eyes. "I'm Amanda Foster," the woman said. "I teach sophomore English. Helen mentioned you were new, and I thought you might appreciate some non-administrative company." "Sarah Chen." "Thanks, I'd like that." Amanda unwrapped her own lunch, glancing around the cafeteria before leaning slightly forward. "Can I ask you something? Off the record?" "Sure. Have you noticed anything strange since you got here?" Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice casual. "Strange how?" "I've been teaching here for 2 years, and in the last 6 months the students have changed. Not all of them, but enough to notice. They're more secretive, more organized. I've caught them in meetings they claim are study groups, but they scatter like I've interrupted something important. And some of their essays. What about their essays? Amanda pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a document. This is from a sophomore writing assignment about current events. Listen to this. The current Earth government's isolationist policies regarding alien contact represent a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity's place in the galactic community. True progress requires embracing change, even when that change challenges traditional power structures. Sarah read the passage twice, her blood cooling. The language was too sophisticated, too politically aware for a 15-year-old. More importantly, it echoed talking points she'd heard from hegemony propaganda broadcasts. Who wrote this? Emma Sullivan. Sweet kid, usually writes about pop culture or school sports. This was completely out of character for her. Amanda's voice dropped further. And she's not the only one. I've got at least 8 students suddenly producing work that sounds like they've been reading political theory texts. Have you reported this to the administration? Amanda's laugh was bitter. I tried. Helen said I was overreacting, that students are just becoming more socially conscious. Dr. Vance actually suggested I might be the one with the problem, that maybe I wasn't challenging them enough academically. The mention of Dr. Vance sent warning signals through Sarah's mind. What's your impression of him? Honestly, he gives me the creeps. He's only been here since the fall, but he's already Helen's go-to guy for technology issues. Students love him, though. He runs an after-school computer programming club that's incredibly popular. Sarah made a mental note to investigate this programming club. In her experience, the most effective infiltration operations always began with identifying and recruiting the most intelligent targets. Amanda, would you be willing to help me with something? Unofficially? The English teacher looked around nervously, then nodded. What did you have in mind? Keep documenting the unusual essays, but also pay attention to which students seem to be influencing others. Social leaders, kids that others look up to. And if you hear about any special meetings or activities, let me know. You think there's really something going on, don't you? Amanda asked. This isn't just teenage rebellion or social media influence. Sarah chose her words carefully. With trust, Teddy, I think your instincts are correct, and I think we need to figure out what's happening before it gets worse. That afternoon, Sarah's official duties continued with more student meetings, but now she approached each interaction as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. The pattern was becoming clearer. Approximately 1 in 4 students showed signs of ideological influence, usually the brightest and most socially connected individuals. They spoke with unusual sophistication about political topics, showed surprising interest in military careers or government positions, and many mentioned participating in Dr. Vance's programming club. As the school day ended, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe students leaving. Most headed directly to buses or cars, but a significant group moved toward a wing of the building she hadn't toured yet. Following at a discreet distance, she watched them enter what appeared to be a computer lab. Through the window, she could see Dr. Vance addressing the assembled students, his gestures animated, his audience hanging on every word. The scene looked innocent enough, a dedicated teacher working with motivated students. But Sarah's combat experience had taught her that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones that appeared completely harmless. Her secure communicator vibrated with an incoming message from Captain Rodriguez. Any updates? Sarah glanced around to ensure she was alone before responding. Possible infiltration confirmed. Request immediate background check on Dr. Marcus Vance, computer science teacher. Also need analysis of student communication patterns. The response came quickly. We'll expedite both requests. Be careful, Chen. If they've made it to the school system, they're further along than we thought. As Sarah walked back to her car, her mind was already planning her next moves. She'd spent 3 years fighting the hegemony among distant stars, learning their tactics, understanding their methods. Now, those same enemies had brought their war to her hometown, targeting the minds of children instead of shooting at soldiers. The girl who'd left Millbrook had been trained to fight aliens in space. The woman returning was realizing that the most important battle of her life might be fought in the hallways of a suburban high school, where the enemy looked human and the weapons were ideas rather than plasma rifles. Tomorrow, she would begin the real war for her hometown soul. Sarah spent the night researching everything she could find about Dr. Marcus Vance, but the official records painted the picture of an exemplary educator, advanced degrees from respected universities, stellar recommendations from previous positions, published papers on educational technology. If there was deception here, it was professionally crafted. She arrived at school early, hoping to observe the building before students arrived. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to maintenance staff and early arriving teachers. Dr. Vance's vehicle, a modest sedan with local license plates, sat in the faculty section. Nothing unusual there, but Sarah made note of the registration number for her report to Captain Rodriguez. Moving through the empty hallways, Sarah noticed details that had escaped her attention during the busy school day. Security cameras in locations that seemed oddly positioned, subtle modifications to several classroom doors, and what appeared to be additional wiring running along corridors in places where building plans wouldn't typically require it. Doctor. Someone had been making systematic changes to the school's infrastructure. Her office felt different this morning, as if someone had been there overnight. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but items on her desk seemed slightly shifted, and her computer screen was warm despite being supposedly shut down. Sarah made a mental note to check for surveillance devices later and to be more careful about what materials she left accessible. The first student appointment of the day was with Emma Sullivan, the sophomore whose essay had caught Amanda's attention. Emma knocked softly and entered with a shy smile, looking exactly like what Sarah would expect from a 15-year-old honor student. Neat appearance, books clutched against her chest. Nervous but polite demeanor. "Hi, Chen. Principal Morrison said you wanted to talk to me about career opportunities." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, studying Emma's face for any signs of the sophisticated political awareness her writing had demonstrated. "Please, sit down. I understand you're doing well academically."
"I try,"
Emma replied modestly. "School's important, you know. My parents always said education is the key to making a difference in the world. That's a mature perspective. What kind of difference are you hoping to make?" Emma's expression shifted subtly, her eyes taking on a more focused quality. "Well, I think our generation faces unique challenges. The old ways of thinking aren't really adequate for the problems we're going to inherit." There it was, the same sophisticated language patterns Amanda had identified. "What kind of problems are you thinking about?" "Global issues," Emma said, her confidence growing. "Easier, resource allocation, international cooperation, adapting to new realities. Sometimes change requires people to let go of outdated assumptions about how things should work." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "That's quite insightful. Where are you learning about these global issues?" "Dr. Vance has been really helpful," Emma replied without hesitation. "He runs this programming club, but we talk about a lot more than just computers. He helps us understand the bigger picture. You know, how technology and politics and social change all connect." "That sounds fascinating. What kind of things does he teach you about politics?" Emma's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "He shows us how to analyze information critically, how to see past surface explanations to understand what's really happening. Like, most people just accept whatever their government tells them, but if you dig deeper, you can see the patterns that show what's really going on." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. Emma's words were almost word-for-word identical to recruitment techniques used by hegemony operative cells she'd infiltrated during her service. Create doubt about existing authority structures, then provide alternative frameworks that seemed more logical and comprehensive. "Emma, can I ask you something personal? How do your parents feel about these new perspectives you're developing?" For the first time, Emma's expression showed uncertainty. They don't really understand. They're stuck in old thinking patterns. Dr. Vance says that's normal, that each generation has to move beyond the limitations of the previous one. Do you feel like your parents love you and want what's best for you? Emma hesitated, as if the question required careful consideration. I mean, they think they do, but love isn't always about supporting someone's growth. Sometimes it's about protecting them from things they're not ready to understand. The clinical detachment in Emma's voice when discussing her parents sent chills down Sarah's spine. She'd heard similar emotional distancing from young hegemony recruits who'd been psychologically conditioned to view family bonds as impediments to ideological purity. Emma, I'd like to visit this programming club sometime. Do you think Dr. Vance would mind having a guest? Oh, I'm sure he'd love to meet you. Emma's enthusiasm returned. He's always interested in talking to people with different backgrounds. Maybe you could share some of your experiences from your military service. After Emma left, Sarah sat in her office trying to process what she'd learned. The girl seemed genuinely happy and intellectually engaged, not like someone being coerced or manipulated. But the subtle shifts in her language, the casual dismissal of her parents' concerns, and the obvious source of her political awakening. Her secure communicator chimed with a message from Captain Rodriguez. Background check complete. Doctor, Marcus Vance doesn't exist before 3 years ago. All credentials fabricated but expertly done. Running biometric analysis now. Sarah's hands tightened on the device. A deep cover operative then, with resources sufficient to create an entirely false identity and academic history. This wasn't some amateur propaganda effort. This was a professional intelligence operation that had been years in the making. Understood, she typed back. How many other schools might be affected? Unknown. We're checking similar demographic profiles nationwide. Your location might be a test case. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Millbrook was a test case, that meant her hometown's children were guinea pigs in some larger hegemony experiment. And if the operation was successful here, it could be replicated in communities across Earth. Amanda Foster appeared in her doorway during lunch period, looking agitated. Can we talk? Of course. Close the door. Amanda sat down, clutching a folder of papers. I've been doing what you suggested, documenting unusual behavior. It's worse than I thought. She spread several essays across Sarah's desk, each showing the same patterns Emma's work had demonstrated. Sophisticated political analysis, critique of traditional authority structures, and language that seemed borrowed from academic sources far beyond high school level. But that's not the most concerning part, Amanda continued. I started paying attention to social dynamics like you suggested. There are students who seem to be actively recruiting others into this mindset. They identify kids who are struggling academically or socially, then gradually introduce them to these ideas. Show me what you mean. Amanda pulled out a notebook filled with observations. Look at this pattern. Take Kevin Morrison. He's a junior who was failing most of his classes last semester. His parents got divorced. He was having trouble making friends. Steady. 3 weeks ago, Emma Sullivan and 2 other students started including him in their group. Now he's suddenly engaged in class discussions. His grades are improving and he's writing essays that sound just like theirs. Sarah studied Amanda's notes, recognizing the recruitment pattern from her military intelligence training. Target vulnerable individuals. Provide them with belonging and purpose. Gradually introduce ideological framework. Then use them to recruit others. Amanda, this is extremely important. Have you noticed whether these students are being given any specific instructions or assignments outside of normal classwork? Actually, yes. I overheard Emma telling Kevin about some kind of research project Dr. Vance assigned to his programming club. They're supposed to analyze social media patterns in their community, identify influence networks and communication channels. Sarah's blood ran cold. Intelligence gathering disguised as an academic exercise. The hegemony operatives weren't just recruiting students, they were using them to map the social structure of the entire community. There's something else, Amanda said quietly. I think they're targeting specific students based on family connections. Emma's father works at the county planning office. Kevin's mom is a nurse at the regional hospital. Another girl in the group, her dad is deputy sheriff. The pattern was becoming clear. Target children of people with access to infrastructure, communications, or security systems. Use the natural trust parents have in their children to gather intelligence about potential vulnerabilities. Amanda, I need you to do something and it might put you at risk. What? I need you to find out when and where this programming club meets. And I need to know if Dr. Vance has requested access to any unusual school resources, databases, communication systems, anything beyond what a computer teacher would normally use. Amanda nodded grimly. I'll see what I can find out. But Sarah, what exactly are we dealing with here? Sarah chose her words carefully. I think someone is using our students for intelligence gathering, possibly as preparation for something larger. I can't give you all the details, but this goes beyond normal concerns about teenage behavior. Foreign agents? Possibly. Which is why we need to be extremely careful. If I'm right, these people have been planning this operation for years. They won't hesitate to eliminate threats to their mission. That afternoon, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the programming club meeting. Through the classroom window, she watched Dr. Vance addressing about 20 students, all of them listening with rapt attention. The scene looked innocent. Dedicated teenagers learning computer skills from an enthusiastic teacher. But Sarah's trained eyes noticed details that would escape civilian observation. The students weren't just listening. They were taking detailed notes in identical notebooks. The wall displays showed network diagrams that looked more like intelligence charts than programming exercises. And Dr. Vance's presentation style, the precise gestures, the way he scanned his audience to ensure comprehension, was identical to briefing techniques used by military intelligence officers. Her secure communicator buzzed with an urgent message, "Biometric analysis complete." Subject matches hegemony, operative designation infiltrator. 7. Wanted for subversion operations on 3 colony worlds. Extremely dangerous. Do not engage directly. Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. Infiltrator. 7 was legendary in Terran Defense Corps intelligence circles, a master of long-term psychological operations who had destabilized entire planetary governments through carefully orchestrated influence campaigns. And now, he was teaching computer science to American teenagers, using the same methods he'd perfected on distant worlds. Another message followed immediately. Backup en route. ETA 72 hours. D. Maintain cover and gather intelligence on scope of operation. Priority is identifying all affected students and any adult collaborators. 2 hours. Sarah had 3 days to figure out how extensive this operation was, how many students were compromised, and what the end game might be. 3 days to prevent whatever infiltrator 7 was building toward in her hometown. As the programming club meeting ended and students began filing out, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench. Several of the departing students were people she recognized from around town. The mayor's daughter, the police chief's son, kids whose parents held positions of influence throughout the community. This wasn't just about recruiting teenagers for some distant ideology. This was about placing compromised individuals in positions where they could influence or subvert every aspect of local government and society. And if Millbrook was indeed a test case, successful implementation here could provide a blueprint for undermining communities across the entire planet. Sarah Chen had fought alien invaders across multiple star systems, but she'd never faced an enemy that attacked by turning children against their own families and communities. As she watched the last of Dr. Vance's students disappear down the hallway, she realized she was looking at the future of warfare. Not ships and plasma rifles, but minds and loyalties. The battle for Earth wasn't being fought in space. It was being fought in the hearts and minds of teenagers in small-town America, and she might be the only person who could stop it. The next morning brought devastating news. Amanda Foster hadn't shown up for work, and when Sarah discreetly called the number she'd been given, it went straight to voicemail. A sick feeling grew in Sarah's stomach as she realized her ally might have pushed too hard too fast in gathering intelligence. Principal Morrison seemed unusually flustered when Sarah asked about Amanda's absence. "Family emergency," she explained, but her eyes didn't meet Sarah's. "She had to leave town suddenly. We're not sure when she'll be back." Sarah nodded and smiled, playing the role of concerned colleague, but internally she was calculating possibilities. Best case scenario, Amanda had genuinely had a family crisis and would return safely. Worst case, infiltrator, Seven had identified her as a threat and eliminated the problem. With only 48 hours until backup arrived, Sarah knew she had to accelerate her investigation despite the increased danger. She spent the morning conducting normal student counseling sessions while mentally cataloging every detail about the school's layout, security systems, and staff behavior patterns. During lunch, she made a decision that violated every protocol about maintaining cover. She needed to get into Dr. Vance's classroom and see what resources he was actually using with his students. The risk was enormous, but time was running out. The computer science classroom was located in the building's newer wing, accessed through a corridor that security cameras didn't fully cover. Sarah had memorized the camera angles during her first days at school, and she knew there was a 30-second window when someone could enter the room without being recorded. She waited until most students were in the cafeteria, then moved quickly through the blind spot. Dr. Vance's classroom looked normal at first glance. Rows of computers, educational posters, the usual clutter of an active learning space. But as Sarah examined the equipment more closely, she found anomalies that confirmed her worst fears. The computers were far more sophisticated than anything a typical high school could afford, with processing power that seemed designed for complex data analysis rather than basic programming instruction. Network cables ran to additional equipment hidden in a locked cabinet that Sarah couldn't open without tools she didn't have access to. More disturbing were the materials she found in Dr. Vance's desk: psychological profiles of every student in his programming club, detailed family background information, and social network analysis charts that mapped relationships throughout the entire community. This wasn't the work of a teacher trying to help students learn technology. This was comprehensive intelligence gathering on an entire population. Hidden beneath seemingly innocent lesson plans, Sarah found documents that made her blood freeze: communication protocols, extraction procedures, and timeline charts that suggested the operation was approaching some kind of culmination event. The dates indicated that whatever infiltrator Seven was building toward would happen within the next week. A sound in the hallway sent Sarah quickly back to the classroom window, peering out to ensure the coast was clear. What she saw made her heart stop. Dr. Vance was walking toward the computer science wing, accompanied by two students she recognized from his programming club. Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds to get out of the room and back to safe territory. She quickly photographed the most important documents with her secure communicator, replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, and slipped out through the same camera blind spot she'd used to enter. Her heart was still pounding when she reached her office, but she forced herself to appear calm as she uploaded the photographed documents to her secure connection with Captain Rodriguez. The response came back almost immediately. "Holy shit, Chen! This is worse than we thought." Sarah typed quickly, "How much worse?" "Those timeline charts match intelligence we've been gathering about similar operations in 12 other communities. This isn't a test case. It's part of a coordinated nationwide campaign. All operations are set to go active within the next 10 days. The magnitude of what she was looking at hit Sarah like a physical blow. Infiltrator Seven wasn't just experimenting with subverting one small town. He was part of a larger network that had been systematically placing operatives in communities across America. "What's the end game?" she messaged back. "Mass civil unrest, breakdown of local authority structures, followed by hegemony peacekeeping intervention. They're planning to destabilize Earth from within, then arrive as saviors to restore order." Sarah stared at the message, her mind reeling. The hegemony had learned that direct military assault on Earth would be too costly. Instead, they'd spent years infiltrating human society, targeting the most vulnerable and impressionable members of each community, turning them into unwitting agents of their own civilization's destruction. Orders: maintain cover at all costs. Backup arrives tomorrow night with a full tactical team. We need you to identify all compromised individuals and determine the exact timeline for local activation. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Sarah conducted her scheduled student meetings, smiled at colleagues, and played the role of dedicated counselor while her mind worked furiously to process what she'd learned. Every student she talked to now fell into one of two categories: potential victims or potential assets of an enemy infiltration campaign. Late that afternoon, Marcus approached her office with a grin that had once been familiar and comforting, but now filled her with dread. "Hey sis, how's your first week going?" "Good," Sarah replied, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "Still adjusting, but the students are great." "That's awesome. Actually, there's this computer programming thing Dr. Vance runs after school. He invited me to check it out today. Says it might be good for my college applications." Every alarm in Sarah's head went off simultaneously. Marcus was exactly the kind of target infiltrator Seven would want: intelligent, connected to a military family, naturally curious about technology. And if they were accelerating recruitment to include her own brother, it suggested the operation was moving faster than intelligence had estimated. "That sounds interesting," she said carefully. "What kind of programming does he teach?" "Cool stuff," Marcus replied, his eyes lighting up. "Not just basic coding, but how computer systems really work, how information flows through networks, how you can analyze data patterns to understand what's really happening in the world." The language patterns were already starting. Sarah felt sick as she recognized the same ideological framework that had captured Emma and the others beginning to take hold in her own brother's mind. "Marcus, can I ask you something? What do you think about the government's handling of the alien situation? The hegemony conflict?" Marcus's expression became more serious, more thoughtful than she'd ever seen from him. "Honestly, I think there's a lot they're not telling us." Dr. Vance showed us some analysis suggesting that the official narrative about the conflict might not be complete. Maybe the hegemony isn't as hostile as the military claims. Sarah had to grip the edge of her desk to keep her hands from shaking. In one afternoon, Infiltrator Seven had begun planting seeds of doubt about the very institutions Sarah had served, using her own brother as a vehicle for propaganda that could eventually turn him against everything she'd fought to protect. "That's an interesting perspective," she managed. "What kind of analysis did he show you?" "Statistical stuff mostly. Casualty reports, resource allocation data, communication intercepts. When you look at the patterns, it suggests that Earth's government might be more aggressive than they admit publicly." Sarah recognized the technique. Take real data, strip away context, and present it in ways that supported predetermined conclusions. It was sophisticated enough that intelligent people would find it convincing, especially when presented by a charismatic authority figure they trusted. "Marcus, promise me something. Before you make any big decisions about your future, talk to Mom and Dad, okay? And to me. Get multiple perspectives before committing to anything." Marcus looked puzzled by her intensity. "Sure, sis. It's just a computer club. You don't have to worry about me." But Sarah was worried, more than she'd ever been during actual combat. In battle, the enemy was clearly defined, and the objectives were straightforward. Here, the enemy looked like a dedicated teacher. The battlefield was the minds of children, and her own family was becoming a target. That evening, Sarah sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at intelligence reports on her secure communicator. The scope of the hegemony infiltration was staggering. Thousands of operatives embedded in communities across Earth, all working toward the same goal of psychological subversion and societal destabilization. But reading the tactical assessments, Sarah began to see patterns that gave her hope. The operations were sophisticated but also fragile, dependent on maintaining the trust and cooperation of their target populations. If the truth could be exposed effectively, if people could be shown what was really happening to their children and communities, the entire network could collapse rapidly. The key was Infiltrator 7 himself. As the senior operative in this region, he would have coordination protocols with other cells, access to the larger operational timeline, and detailed information about the planned activation sequence. Capturing him wouldn't just save Millbrook, it could provide intelligence that would help expose the entire nationwide network. Sarah's secure communicator buzzed with a final message from Captain Rodriguez. Change of plans. Intelligence suggests activation has been moved up. All cells going active tomorrow night. Backup team will be late. You may need to act alone. Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing through possibilities. Tomorrow night, less than 24 hours to prevent whatever infiltrators 7 had planned for her hometown. And she would have to do it without backup, without support, possibly without any help at all. She thought about Emma Sullivan, so enthusiastic about her new worldview, about Kevin Morrison, finding belonging and purpose for the first time, about her own brother Marcus, already beginning to question everything their family had taught him about right and wrong. These weren't enemy soldiers to be defeated in battle. They were victims of a sophisticated psychological attack, children whose natural curiosity and idealism had been weaponized against their own communities. Whatever Sarah did to stop Infiltrator 7, she had to do it in a way that saved the students rather than simply eliminating the threat. As she planned her next moves, Sarah realized that this mission would require every skill she'd learned during 3 years of interstellar warfare. But more than that, it would require something the military hadn't taught her, the wisdom to fight an enemy without destroying the people caught in the crossfire. Tomorrow night, the fate of her hometown, her family, and potentially her entire planet would depend on whether a small-town girl turned space marine could outmaneuver one of the galaxy's most dangerous infiltration specialists. The war had come home, and Sarah Chen was the only thing standing between Earth and a nightmare disguised as education. The final day arrived with deceptive normalcy. Students chatted in hallways, teachers conducted classes, and the rhythms of small-town life continued as if the entire community wasn't balanced on the edge of a precipice. Sarah moved through her scheduled appointments with mechanical precision, her mind focused entirely on the intelligence she'd gathered and the plan taking shape in her thoughts. By mid-afternoon, she'd confirmed that tonight's programming club meeting would be different. Students had been told to bring overnight bags for a special project that would run late into the evening. Parents had received official-looking permission slips explaining that Dr. Vance was conducting an advanced workshop on network security that required extended lab time. Sarah recognized the setup from her intelligence training: isolate the target population, control their environment, and execute the final phase of psychological conditioning when they were most vulnerable. Tonight, Infiltrator 7 would complete whatever process he'd been building toward for months. Her secure communicator showed no messages from Captain Rodriguez, which meant the backup team was still hours away. Whatever happened tonight, she would face it alone. At 3:30 p.m., as the regular school day ended, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe students heading to the programming club meeting. 23 teenagers filed into Dr. Buke Vance's classroom carrying backpacks and sleeping bags, their faces bright with excitement about their special advanced lesson. Among them was Marcus, and Sarah felt her heart clench as she watched her little brother walk unknowingly into what might be the most dangerous night of his life. Sarah waited until the building had mostly cleared, then made her way to the administrative offices. If she was going to stop whatever was planned for tonight, she needed to understand exactly what resources Infiltrator Teddy 7 had access to. More importantly, she needed to find evidence that would convince local authorities to act, even if they weren't prepared to believe the truth about alien infiltration. The principal's office was locked, but Sarah's military training included skills that weren't part of standard career counseling education. Within 90 seconds, she was inside Helen Morrison's private space, searching for clues about how deep the conspiracy ran. What she found was worse than she'd feared. Hidden in a locked file cabinet were communication logs showing that Principal Morrison had been in regular contact with someone identified only as Regional Coordinator. The messages discussed student selection criteria, family background assessments, and timeline adjustments that matched perfectly with the activation schedule Sarah had discovered in Infiltrator. 7's classroom. Principal Morrison wasn't just aware of the operation. She was an active collaborator, possibly another hegemony operative with deep cover going back years. The entire school administration might be compromised. A sound in the outer office sent Sarah quickly back to the window, but instead of hiding, she made a decision that would have horrified her commanding officers. She was done with covert observation. It was time to force a confrontation on her terms, rather than waiting for the enemy to complete their plan. Sarah walked boldly into the main hallway and headed directly toward the computer science wing. Through the classroom window, she could see Dr. Vance addressing his assembled students, all of whom sat in perfect rows, notebooks open, writing intently as he spoke. The scene looked like any advanced class, but Sarah's trained eye noticed the subtle differences. The ritualistic precision of the students' postures, the way they wrote without looking up, the almost hypnotic quality of their focus. She pushed open the classroom door and stepped inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Dr. Vance turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Chen, how nice of you to join us. We were just discussing advanced network architecture." "Is that what you call it?" Sarah let her military bearings show for the first time since arriving at the school. "I'd be very interested to hear your curriculum." The students looked up from their notebooks with identical expressions of mild confusion, as if they were emerging from some kind of trance state. Sarah noticed that several of them, including Marcus, seemed to have trouble focusing their eyes. "Actually," Dr. Vance continued smoothly, "this might be perfect timing. We were just beginning a section on military communication systems. Your expertise could be invaluable." "I'm sure it could be." Sarah stepped further into the room, positioning herself where she could see all the students while keeping Dr. Vance in her peripheral vision. "What specific systems are you studying?" "Oh, just general principles, information flow, command hierarchies, trust networks, how military organizations maintain control over large populations." There it was. The subtle shift from education to ideological conditioning. Sarah could see it happening in real time, as Dr. Vance's voice took on a more rhythmic quality, his gestures becoming more hypnotic. "The interesting thing about military systems," he continued, "is how they depend on unquestioning obedience from people who don't have access to complete information. Soldiers follow orders without understanding the larger strategic picture." Several students nodded thoughtfully, their notebooks forgotten. Sarah recognized the technique. Use her presence to validate his authority, then gradually undermine confidence in military institutions. "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd learned on alien battlefields. "Of course there's another way to look at it." "Doctor," Vance's smile faltered slightly. "Oh?" "Military systems work because they're based on trust earned through demonstrated competence and sacrifice. Soldiers follow orders because their leaders have proven they can be trusted with lives." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke directly to the students. "Real leadership doesn't require hypnosis or psychological manipulation. It earns loyalty through actions." "Ms. Chen," Dr. Vance said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "I'm not sure this is appropriate for—" "What's not appropriate," Sarah interrupted, "is using children as weapons against their own families and communities." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Several students looked confused, but others, the ones who'd been most deeply affected by the conditioning, showed flickers of recognition, as if some part of them had always known something was wrong. Emma Sullivan raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Chen, what do you mean about weapons?" "I mean that Dr. Vance isn't who he claims to be, and this isn't really about computer programming." Sarah kept her voice calm but clear. Everything he's taught you about questioning authority, about your parents not understanding the real world, about the need for change, it's all preparation for something that would destroy everything you actually care about. Dr. Vance stepped forward and Sarah caught the subtle shift in his posture that indicated combat training. Miss Chen, you're obviously disturbed about something. Perhaps you should... What I should do, Sarah said, pulling out her secure communicator and displaying the intelligence photos she'd taken, is show these students what you really are. The classroom fell silent as Sarah held up the device, showing images of the psychological profiles, the communication protocols, the evidence that their beloved teacher had been cataloging them like experimental subjects. Your real name is Infiltrator 7, she continued, watching Dr. Vance's face carefully. You're a hegemony operative who's been preparing these students to help destabilize their own communities from within. Tonight was supposed to be the final conditioning session before activation. Marcus stood up slowly, his face pale. Sarah, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that our enemies learned they couldn't defeat humanity in open warfare, so they decided to turn us against ourselves instead. Sarah's voice carried the pain of someone who'd seen too much. They identified the brightest, most idealistic young people in each community, then gradually convinced them that their families, their government, their entire society is corrupt and needs to be destroyed. Dr. Vance laughed, but there was something brittle in the sound. This is quite a fantasy, Miss Chen. Do you have any evidence to support these wild accusations? I have 3 years of combat experience fighting hegemony infiltration operations on frontier worlds. Sarah pulled out her military identification. I have biometric analysis confirming your identity as a wanted enemy agent, and I have intelligence showing that similar operations are happening in communities across Earth, all scheduled to activate tonight. The students were looking back and forth between Sarah and Dr. Vance, uncertainty replacing the confident certainty they'd shown moments before. Sarah could see the psychological conditioning beginning to crack as they were forced to confront contradictory information. Emma, Sarah said gently, remember how you told me your parents don't understand the real world? How Dr. Vance taught you that love sometimes means protecting people from things they're not ready to understand? Does that sound like something you would have believed 6 months ago? Emma's face showed the first signs of real doubt. No, but Kevin, you told me your grades improved after you started attending this club. But did you ever wonder why you suddenly became interested in political theory instead of the things you used to care about? Kevin Morrison looked confused, then frightened, as if he was trying to remember something that had been systematically erased from his mind. Dr. Vance realized his control was slipping. Students, this woman is clearly having some kind of psychological breakdown. Military service can be very traumatic, and sometimes veterans develop paranoid delusions about... The only delusion here, Sarah interrupted, is the one you've spent months creating in these kids' minds. She turned back to the students, her voice gentle but urgent. 6 months ago, did any of you think your parents were stupid or evil? Did you believe your community needed to be fundamentally changed? Did you want to dedicate your lives to political causes you'd never heard of before? The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could see awareness dawning in face after face as the students began to recognize the artificial nature of the beliefs that had been implanted in their minds. Marcus spoke first, his voice small and frightened. Sarah, I've been thinking things, feeling things that don't make sense. Like, I don't trust Mom and Dad anymore, but I can't remember why. That's because there is no why, Sarah replied. You were being psychologically conditioned to doubt everything that keeps our society stable, to prepare you for something that would hurt everyone you actually love. Dr. Vance made his move then, lunging toward a control panel Sarah hadn't noticed. But 3 years of combat had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. She intercepted him before he could reach whatever emergency system he'd been trying to activate, using techniques that sent him to the floor in seconds. Students, get out of the room now, she commanded. Call your parents, tell them to come get you immediately. As the teenagers filed out, most looking dazed and confused, Marcus lingered behind. Sarah, how long have you known? Since my first day back, she admitted. I came here thinking I'd have an easy assignment helping kids plan their futures. Instead, I found an enemy that had spent years planning to steal those futures away. Emergency vehicles were already approaching. Sarah's secure communicator had automatically transmitted her location and status when the confrontation began. But as she watched her brother and his classmates reunite with their panicked parents in the school parking lot, she realized the real victory wasn't in capturing Infiltrator 7. The real victory was in the faces of kids who were remembering why they loved their families, who were questioning the dark thoughts that had been planted in their minds, who were choosing connection over ideology. 23 young people had been pulled back from the edge of something that would have destroyed not just their own lives but the fabric of their entire community. Captain Rodriguez arrived with the tactical team 2 hours later, but by then the crisis was over. Infiltrator 7 was in custody. His communication equipment had revealed the locations of 11 other operative cells across the country, and the psychological conditioning he'd spent months implementing was already beginning to unravel as students talked with their families and mental health professionals. Hell of a job, Chen, Rodriguez said as they watched the last of the students being reunited with their parents. How did you know the conditioning would break so easily? Sarah smiled, thinking of the speech Dr. Vance had made about military systems depending on unquestioning obedience, because he fundamentally misunderstood what makes humans strong. It's not our individual capabilities or our technology. It's the fact that we refuse to give up on each other. She looked across the parking lot, where Marcus was hugging their parents while trying to explain what had happened to him. The hegemony's biggest mistake was thinking they could turn that strength into a weakness. They never understood that the connections between us aren't chains to be broken. They're the source of everything we fight for. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen stood once again in her childhood bedroom, but this time she was packing for a new assignment. The Terran Defense Corps was creating a new division focused on countering psychological warfare operations, and they wanted her to help design training programs based on what she'd learned in Millbrook. Before she left, she stopped by the high school one more time. The building looked the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Students moved with the natural energy of teenagers again, free from the artificial intensity that had marked Dr. Vance's influence. Teachers smiled more readily, and parents were more involved in school activities than they'd been in months. Emma Sullivan found her in the hallway during lunch period. Ms. Chen, I wanted to thank you. For what? For helping me remember who I really am. Emma's voice was quiet but strong. I've been thinking about what I want to do after graduation, and I think I want to study psychology. Maybe help other kids who get manipulated like we were. Sarah smiled. That sounds like an excellent plan. The galaxy needs people who understand how to protect minds as well as bodies. As Sarah walked out of Millbrook High School for the last time, she reflected on what she'd learned during her brief return home. She'd left Earth as a girl who wanted to see the stars and serve humanity among distant worlds. She was returning to space as a woman who understood that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with truth, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between people who refused to give up on each other. The war with the hegemony was far from over, but humanity had learned something important about their enemies' methods. More importantly, they'd learned something about their own resilience. No matter how sophisticated the psychological attacks became, no matter how cleverly their enemies tried to turn them against each other, humans had something that couldn't be programmed or conditioned away. They had each other. And that would always be enough.